We turn now to a discussion of atheism in the philosophy of religion, atheism being the belief in the non-existence of God, and depicted here by something that looks like the Big Bang, as it were, which is somehow associated with atheism, though that's not completely clear to me. But at any rate, in philosophy, often what we're doing is we're wrestling with the legitimacy of ideas. And God being a very big idea, the perspective of the atheist is, in philosophy, is based on this problem of evil, which states that if God is so good, why is there evil in the world? And to attempt to answer this problem, we refer to as Theodicy. Leibniz devoted much of his attention to this. So theodicy is the logical arguments attempting to solve the problem of evil. And the problem is stated this way. If evil exists, and we believe that it does, right? Well, then, one, God cannot do anything about evil, or two, God allows evil. Well, the problem here being that if God cannot do anything about evil, then he is not omnipotent. If God allows evil, then God is not perfect. So for the atheist, they feel that if you have to conclude one or two, then this God violates the definition of God and thus does not exist. So for the atheist, they're saying the very idea of God is impossible when faced with the reality in life of evil and pain. Well, the traditional way of answering this problem is in the assumptions. Those assumptions being, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, why do we assume that we should not have to experience any pain in life? We in fact see that much of good in life is the result of suffering and pain. But before you even go there, the question is, well, why is it not legitimate for God, being omnipotent and perfect, to allow pain? There's nothing about perfection and omnipotence that precludes pain in life. Not logically, anyway. Well, all right, but what if God eliminated all evil tonight at midnight? I mean, we often think, wow, wouldn't that be perfect? We'd have a nice big party and get out the hats and hooters at midnight, and we're just going to have a great time because life's going to be so much better. Yeah, it would be if, in fact, you are still here at 12:01. Why is it that we always think evil is external to us? It's out there, but it's not in us. Makes you think twice about that, doesn't it? Well, at any rate, the other assumption that I alluded to is that God cannot use suffering to bring about good. God is all-powerful. He could do that. And we often see that in life, much of the good in life is a result of suffering. And in fact, some good can only be brought about through suffering. However, if it's your child that is dying from cancer, these words may not be too comforting. But again, we're trying to deal with the logic rather than the emotions associated with this issue. Well, all right. So theodicy really, and the problem of evil is the main argument in philosophy against the idea of God. But there are many complaints that others have about religion. And we can start with Marx, who Marx's position really was the undermining of religious faith by claiming to reveal that our motives for belief are fallacious and illusory, mere human projections. Marx didn't like to think of himself as a philosopher, certainly not a theologian. He didn't believe in God, and he wanted to be thought of as a scientist, a social scientist, and that money is what drives everything. Our need for goods and services. That's what life is about, and religion just hovers around on the periphery of this central fact of needing things. And he claims that those in power simply use religion to convince people who are less fortunate to continue to work and not complain, to work for low wages, and trust that they will be rewarded in an afterlife, that they are pleasing God and they will be rewarded in an afterlife. And for Marx, he saw that as terribly manipulative and oppressive, and that that's all religion has ever done, and that that it's a projection, a mere. When he talks about, when he refers to mere human projections, he's referring to the idea of a father up in heaven that has all the power and who rewards his children or punishes them. And this kind of mere projection of the family dynamic. And he said that this is really one of our big problems. He called religion the opiate of the people, the opiate of the masses, that it makes you not feel your pain in the present, numbs you, and allows those in power to use you like slaves in the service of making God happy, supposedly. And he didn't like that. Well, that's a complaint about the misuse of religion, and it's a legitimate one. When religion does that, it should stop. Freud, too, says religion is a delusion that protects us from the truth. He writes about that in his little book called The Future of an Illusion. Freud, raised in a religious home, his father was hoping he'd become a rabbi, but he was interested in science, and he became a doctor. And he would say, look, what's the first thing we learn as human beings? The first thing we learn when we're just a few days old is that if you scream out to the heavens when you're in pain, your cries will be answered. We cried out and we got scooped up by this beautiful, loving, godlike creature, and suddenly our pain disappeared. And every time it seemed that we cried out that this pattern would happen. And he says, and we never forget that. And we human beings, that's why we're all religious, is because of that early imprinting and that need to believe that there is something out there that's holding it all together, that is bringing meaning to our lives. And he says, that's just not true. As far as Freud was concerned, he says, that's not true. That's not the way life is. That's an illusion. a delusion, and it's inappropriate for the modern man, he felt. Again, he believes it's the cause of more oppression than of freedom. Well, we've seen religion do this. Not wholesale, not always, but we have seen that this is a legitimate complaint about religion. Soren Kierkegaard, he's not an atheist, he's a theologian, and but he was very upset with the way people were approaching religion. They were just in his town, there were what he would refer to as card-carrying Lutherans. In other words, there was no sense of faith, or it wasn't important to them. It just it was nothing more than a membership. And he wants to say, no, this is not what God had in mind. And he takes us to the story of Abraham and Isaac. You remember, God comes to Abraham and says, leave your people and your country and come with me. I will show you a promised land and give you many, many descendants, right? Which was like saying, yeah, I'll make you very successful and wealthy. Well, Abraham agrees, and lo and behold, he's in his 90s and still has no children. But then God does bless them with a child, a miraculous child, Isaac. And when Isaac gets to be a young boy, grows up to be a young boy, and then God comes to him and tells him that he wants him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, in ancient pagan culture, child sacrifice was not completely unusual. That wasn't so much or it wasn't the only tension. It was that he's in his 90s, he has this child of promise that proves that God is real and keeps his promises. And now he's going to kill it? He'll never get another chance like this. And yet, Abraham, known as the father of the faith, is willing to go through with this. And of course, just as he lifts the knife, this angel stops him in the story and says, essentially, okay, you passed. Kierkegaard wants to say, this is the kind of faith that is required of you. Might require you to suspend your whole ethical sense. God might ask you to do something crazy like that, embracing the absurd, a huge leap of faith. This is, for Kierkegaard, this is what it meant to be a follower of Christ, not someone who's a mere card-carrying member of some particular order. And then, of course, we have Nietzsche, who said God is dead. And what he meant was that, this antiquated way of thinking about God is no longer viable. The old man in the sky on a throne with, the adoring of the chosen. And he would say the problem with this is that it cripples us in our progress. It keeps us from developing as a species. This would be Nietzsche's complaint, is that you recall in his genealogy of morals that he said, if this big lummox of low intelligence was about to harm you, you might very well, if you're clever enough, convince him that there's a God in heaven that will punish him if he hurts you. And thus, a weaker person can control a more powerful person, but they have to appeal to this idea of God. And so he says, and that's how morals came about. It's nothing more than weaker people trying to control people with more of a master mentality. Well, okay, again, this is a legitimate complaint about the abuse of religion. We have seen religion be used this way, and it's not good. Jesus himself criticized the religious establishment. Before we close our ears to some of the complaints of these anti-religion people, we need to remember that Jesus was put on a cross for his criticizing of religious establishment. So, again, these are not proofs against the existence of God. These are complaints about religion and religiosity and how it can be misused. And they're very legitimate complaints coming from Jesus himself. And it all goes back to how you relate to God, I think. From the word religio, Latin word meaning to relate to or to bind. I think that's what's key. And depicted here we have the story of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's two sons. And in the story, God asks them to both offer a sacrifice. And Cain, being a tiller of the soil, offers up the first fruits of his produce on the altar. And on Abel's altar, he being a sheep herder, offers the finest of his flock. Well, the story says that God accepts Abel's sacrifice but rejects Cain's. And Cain becomes so infuriated that he kills his brother Abel. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a nice explanation in the Bible as to why God rejected Cain's sacrifice. But I like to speculate that perhaps it was in the way they were relating to God. Cain offers up food, sustenance. So as it burns and as the smoke rises in ancient cultures, it was believed, it's an aroma and it's sustenance for the gods, and it helps the gods. And in return, like a vending machine, God blesses the crops and whatnot. So it's a give and take arrangement, right? Whereas in Abel's situation, you don't sacrifice typically the finest. You breed the finest so that your flock will be stronger and healthy and flourish, and thus your future will be more secure. But here Abel offers up his finest to God, which is a kind of letting go of control. Cain, in the story, could be interpreted as grasping for control by trying to please God and make a deal, as it were. The basic stuff of human relations. I do something for you, and you do something for me. Whereas Abel is just offering a sacrifice in obedience and letting go of control and just giving his most to God, even if it's a true sacrifice in the sense that it does not make his life easier. It may, in fact, make his life harder, but nonetheless, that's how he's going to relate to God, in openness, and not grasping to try and control God, which, in a sense, is the greatest of all delusions.